Hey guys, Lewis here, and in today's video, I'm going to give you my takeaways and also my opinion on the book Fluent Forever. Now, this is a book written by Gabriel Wyner, and it's a number one bestseller in terms of language learning on Amazon. I read it a few years ago and I reread it recently in order to give you my opinions on it and key ideas of the book. So first of all, what is Fluent Forever? Fluent Forever is a book written by Gabriel Wyner, who is an opera singer. It essentially narrates his journey into, language learning and gives you actual advice based on science. If you don't know me, by the way, my name is Lewis, and I'm also into language learning science. So I've interviewed dozens of scientists in this field of, second language acquisition, vocabulary research, and so on. You can watch the interviews on my channel. And I'm also a language learner. So I've learned multiple languages, English being one of them. I'm a French speaker, Japanese as well. And so I have a lot of ideas about this book. So the book starts by introducing three foundational keys, sort of the three pillars of the method. So the three pillars are number one, learn pronunciation first. Number two, don't translate. And number three, use a spaced repetition system. All right, so number one, learn pronunciation first. Let me start with that. Gabriel Wyner is, his background is, he's an opera singer. And so focusing on sounds early is pretty important to him. And so the reasons that he gives for that is that, when you focus on pronunciation first, your ears become tuned to the sounds of the language. It makes learning vocabulary and, listening comprehension easier. And also you're more likely to build a more accurate accent from the start. I don't think this is very controversial. When you look at learning a language in general, there are three aspects. So pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary, broadly speaking. Pronunciation is probably the part where there is, I'm not going to say it's easy, it's not, but there is much less information to learn than in the other two compartments, right? According to Professor Paul Nation, when I talked to him, grammar, you can learn pretty much all the grammar that you need to know in any language in about 2 years of high school or 1 year of college. Vocabulary, it's much more. There are thousands of words that you need to know to learn a language. Specifically, taking the example of English, and we can sort of think that it's about the same for other languages. It may be a little bit different, but according to the statistics given by Professor Paul Nation, if you want to learn vocabulary, the 5,000 most common words to know about 98% of all the running words in a movie. The point is, yes, learning pronunciation first makes sense. You need to build a good accent and make listening comprehension easier, and there's not too much information. The second key, however, don't translate. I have a lot of ideas on this. The idea here is that you need to avoid using your native language. So for most people watching this video, avoid using English when learning a second language. And so you need to think directly in your target language, in the language that you're trying to learn, and this prevents decoding sentences word by word. Now, there's some truth to this. I actually talked about this with Dr. Irina L. Gort. First of all, it's not a crime. When you're a beginner, according to Dr. Irina L. Gort, it's almost unavoidable that you're going to use translations to help you learn the language. When you're a beginner and you're learning, I don't know, vocabulary words, the best way to really do this efficiently is to do this with translations. At the beginning, I'm not saying this is the ideal way to do this, but when you're a beginner, it's much more practical. It's much faster. Now, when you get to higher level, according to Dr. Irina L. Gort, again, you can watch the interview. I'll put the link in the description if you want. You can use target language definitions. So for example, if you're trying to learn a word in the language, like in Spanish, for example, when you've built up a base of vocabulary, you have a certain level in the language, let's call it, I don't know, intermediate, maybe lower intermediate. Then instead of relying on translations, you can have, you have a word in Spanish and you have a very simple definition of that word in Spanish, right? That could be an idea. The whole sort of reasoning for this is that if you have a definition, a simple definition in the target language, it's more likely that the connections that you're going to build when learning this information, when learning this word, the connection is going to be faster because it's in the same language. Whereas when you're using translation, it's likely that it's not going to be as fast because you're switching languages anyway. So Don't translate, you know, I think this is one of the ideas in the book, but I think it's a bit, you know, it's turned into a bit of a religion in, you know, language learning circles. All right, so the third idea, the third foundational key of the book, Fluent Forever, is using a spaced repetition system. I don't think this is very controversial. So SRS, for those of you guys who don't know, you know, now a lot of successful language learners, including myself, we're using these spaced repetition systems, which are, you know, software applications that you can use, and they're, you know, flashcard applications essentially. So they're the book introduces them as, you know, flashcards on steroids essentially. So what this does is, you know, you create flashcards on your computer, on your phone, and the reviews for the flashcards are scheduled right before you're about to forget that piece of information. And so this makes memorization more efficient in the short term, but also it makes you memorize things in the long term. This is not very controversial, right? A lot of people use this. I'm using this. I've used this for Japanese. I've gotten, you know, crazy results in terms of vocabulary growth, but we're going to dig into this a little bit later. All right, so these are the three foundational keys. Now, I want to also talk about, you know, chapter 2 of the book, I think. It's called Principles to End Forgetting. So we're getting into some more practical stuff. So there are multiple principles that I got from the book. Number one principle is you need to make memories more memorable. You know, apart from the pronunciation part at the start of the book, the whole book is very focused on vocabulary, which is something that I like. You know, it's a common theme throughout, you know, my videos. I think a lot of people are not aware of the fact that, you know, if you're new to language learning, then probably, I don't know, you learned or you attempted to learn a language in high school. Maybe you took, you know, Spanish classes like me for 5 years. At the end of it, I couldn't have a proper conversation in Spanish. And a lot of what you do in school is really focus a lot on the grammar and, you know, do the exercises and maybe read short texts and, you know, comprehension like questions and stuff like that. But you don't spend a lot of time deliberately learning vocabulary. And, you know, first of all, vocabulary is by far the most important and the most problematic aspect of language learning. This is a question that I asked, you know, to Dr. Norbert Schmidt, who is, you know, a top vocabulary researcher from the University of Nottingham. And yeah, told me, look, vocabulary, there's no doubt that it's the most important thing. Like you need to focus on this. And how do you focus on vocabulary? Not by reading, not by listening. I mean, you can, you know, look, like you're going to learn vocabulary doing these things, but you need to deliberately go about and, you know, learn these words. Like actually don't do just reading and listening. Actually learn the words for real. And so the whole book, you know, Fluent Forever really focuses on vocabulary. And so the first principle that I got, a very practical principle, I would say, is, you know, you need to make memories more memorable, like vocabulary more memorable. Your brain, there's so much information coming at you every single day, and your brain is just going to filter out information that it finds irrelevant because you're not going to remember everything. It's just stupid. So the way that you make, you know, foreign words, because foreign words, you know, in essence, they just sound irrelevant because they're made up of weird sounds. They're not really connected to anything in your mind, and they're very forgettable. So how do you make them more memorable? Gabriel Wyner suggests here that first of all, you connect a vocabulary word with its associated sound, right? So you need to know how the word is pronounced. And this is where it's really, really important that when you're studying with your flashcards, you need to have some sort of audio. I know so many people who, you know, they're using Anki, you know, free piece of software for doing flashcards. It's an SRS, as I said, and they don't have audio on their flashcards. Like, how do you, you know, you're wasting a lot of time here. Once you've associated the word with a sound, you need to associate, you know, the word with an image. If you're learning the word apple in Spanish, I don't know what it is, you need to have an image because, you know, it's more just having the sound in the word. It's not going to be as memorable as having an image. In addition to having the image, it's also important, according to the author, to sort of link this image and this word with some sort of personal experience. So it's not enough to just have an image of the apple. You need to think about a personal experience and how to link it how to link this word, how to link this image into your memory by linking it to other existing memories. So that's kind of the idea here. My thoughts on this are that, pretty much anything that you can do with vocabulary words to sort of expand and really work and try to put it in your memory, that's going to be good for long-term memorization. That's going to be a good approach. I don't know about this exact process that Gabriel Wyner gives. I've talked with Professor Paul Nation and we talked about using mnemonics to do something similar, have better make vocabulary more memorable. So I just want to present it to you because it's very similar. So the keyword technique, it's something that I've been using ever since I did the interview with Professor Paul Nation, and man, it's a game changer, honestly. So the keyword technique has been studied by 50 to 70 plus studies, and it's been shown to increase learning by 20 to 25%. So what you do, for example, let me try to think of an example. All right, so I have a good example, right? So if you're learning Japanese and you're learning the word, let's say, cat, nickel. So the word nickel is not very memorable because it sounds weird, right? For an English speaker, it's not linked to anything. So what do you do? How do you go about remembering that word? So nickel, which is cat, kind of sounds like neck. So what you can do is you make up a little mnemonic using the keyword technique. So imagine a cat wrap around your neck, for example, right? And it's kind of like it forms a kind of a scarf. And now when you need to say the word cat, you remember this image of a cat, wrapped around your neck, and you know that, neck, neck, neck. Okay, what was it? Oh, nickel. All right, so it gives you a very, very big hint about how the word is supposed to be said. And so it's a very, very good way to remember words. Now, let me reassure you, this sounds very artificial. It sounds like if you do this for every word, then you're just going to speak weird. The truth is, this technique, in my experience, this is very good for initially, at the start when it's really hard to remember the word. You cement it in your mind. You use that mnemonic, that keyword technique. But then over time, when I review my flashcards, there are plenty of flashcards where I use the keyword technique, but then, over time, you don't think about the mnemonic anymore. It's just useful at the beginning to really cement it in your mind. And by the way, I made Anki decks, so, vocabulary decks at ankicoredex.com. These are my decks that use, the keyword technique for all of the flashcards. I'll just put a link to my vocabulary decks in the description because I think that they use a lot of the techniques and, the information used in the Fluent Forever book. So just go there if you're interested. All right, and the second principle that I want to talk about from the book is you need to maximize laziness. So essentially, here Gabriel says that when you're learning vocabulary specifically, you need to study the vocabulary until you manage to recall it just once and then stop. So no cramming. If you know a vocabulary word, it's not useful to study it multiple times and study it, tomorrow and the day after and so on. Study it once and then study it, after a bigger interval of time. And the idea here is that, cramming stuff is not very useful. You get the impression, you get this illusion that actually when you're reviewing a word multiple times in the short term, then you know it very well because you managed to recall it. But the truth is, this short-term retention does not necessarily translate into long-term retention of the word. So you're kind of wasting time. Now, to be honest, this idea here, it's a pretty good idea, but if you're using a spaced repetition system like Anki, for example, it's not going to be something that you necessarily need to think about because the SRS, the piece of software like Anki, they're going to take care of this for you. So you don't need to worry about this. All right. And the third principle that I remember from the book is, and this is something that I think it's so important, you need to, so they call it don't review, recall. So what is meant by this in the book is that, using what is called active recall is much more efficient, it's much more effective than just passive rereading of words. So you need to test yourself on vocabulary, right? And this is an idea that is so fundamental to learning languages and just to learning science in general. So the idea here is that, for example, if you're trying to learn vocabulary, and again, this is the most important aspect of language learning, right? There are thousands of words to learn. A passive approach would be this, right? You're reading a text and there are words that you don't understand. You look them up in a dictionary and you're like, oh, okay, that's what it means, right? Okay, good. Not saying that this is bad. I mean, reading is excellent for building up your vocabulary and for language learning in general. But in terms of deliberately going about learning vocabulary, you need to use active recall instead of just looking up words and saying, oh, okay, that's what it means. You need to use your flashcard system and actually try to recall the word. Now, there are two ways of doing this. Number one is, say you're learning Spanish, right? So you have a word in front of the flashcard on your app, and the word is in Spanish, for example. You're like, okay, caballo. Okay, what does this mean? And you try to recall, okay, caballo, it's like horse. All right, good. That's the first type of recall, right? Second type of recall is you have the opposite. So you have the word in English, horse, and you're trying to think, okay, how do I say this in Spanish? Caballo. All right, good. These two types of recall are useful. Now, I will say that if you had to do just one of them, then just do the English to target language. So horse, try to guess in my mind, okay, caballo. This type of recall is more effortful than, the opposite, going from caballo to horse, but you're more likely to, it's going to work both ways. If you remember that horse is caballo, then when you hear caballo, it's much more likely that you're going to know that this is horse, right? So this is a very, very important aspect of learning languages, active recall. Again, in my Anki Codex, this is a principle that I do implement. Link in the description if you're interested. And the last principle, I think this is a little bit more controversial, or not really controversial, but I guess my own experience sort of differs here. The last principle is wait, don't tell me. So that's just the title. Essentially, the idea here is that when you're testing yourself on vocabulary, then, the best sort of testing happens when you're about to forget the word, when it's really hard for you to recall the word, right? So when you're near forgetting, this is where your memory of the word is going to get strengthened. Now, I have a lot of ideas on this because obviously this is a pretty common idea in the SRS, excuse me, SRS world. The idea that you really need to space out your repetitions and make sure that, the words, you don't review them too frequently. They really need to be near forgetting before you review them. It's kind of like, I don't know if you guys know Dragon Ball. It's like, in Dragon Ball, like the guys, they train in this like capsule until they're almost dead, and then because they push themselves to this limit, then they become so much better. It's kind of like that. Now, here's my experience on this, right? If you try to review words and they're, very spaced apart, there is a chance that, because you don't really know what the interval is going to be, if you space them, if you schedule them, too much in the future, there is a chance that this item, this vocabulary word will be forgotten. And, you're wasting some time there, right? It's really, really hard to estimate when you are near this forgetting point. And flashcard applications, they're going to try to do this, but the truth is it's not an exact science. It depends on the person. It depends on your native language and your target language. It depends on the word. It depends on so many things. It's impossible to accurately estimate when you're near forgetting that word. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, if you review that same word too often, all right, you're more likely to, remember it, but, number one, you're wasting a lot of time because you have, more reviews in the same interval. And number two, it's not a guarantee that you're going to remember it in the long term. So there's kind of a trade-off here. It's not exactly clear where that point is. My advice here is, if you're using Anki, then don't worry about it too much. Just learn what the different grading buttons do and make sure to use the FSRS algorithm. All right, so that's pretty much it for my ideas on, Fluent Forever. Now, I did leave out some of the last sections of the book. Let me know in the comments if you want me to make a video on these ideas from the last part of the book. Also, once again, I would recommend taking a look at my Anki Codex. They're available for multiple languages, thousands of words based on, a frequency analysis in the language. There are tons of mnemonics. There's audio included as well. So check out the Anki Codex in the description. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.